Oftentimes, Republicans will ask the question, hey, gun control, it wouldn't make any difference anyway, would it? And they just assume that it wouldn't, but in reality, of course, there are facts. First of all, one of the excuses they use is, well, there's sometimes mass killings in other countries. In fact, John McCain, perfect example of that over the weekend. Let's watch.
Can't we do anything to stop this?
I don't know, to tell you the truth, what we can do, and this immediately leads to the issue of gun control. The killer in Norway was in a country that had very strict gun control laws, and yet he was still able to acquire the necessary means to initiate and carry out a mass slaughter. I think we need to look at everything, if everything should be looked at. But to think that somehow gun control is, or increased gun control is the answer, in my view, that would have to be proved. Well, first of all, let's remember it's a constitutional right. Second of all, I think that if you could prove the case that indeed has a positive effect, but to somehow leap to the conclusion that this was somehow caused by the fact that we don't have more gun control legislation, I don't think has been proved.
No, it hasn't been proven. And look at Norway. I mean, since they had that one shooting, they're probably the same as us. Except, here comes facts. In 1997, there was a study in Norway. Oops, turns out that their U.S. firearm homicide rate is 23 times higher than Norway's. 23 times higher. Now look, you can say, hey, that was back in 1997. In 2009, a different study showed that we had a 15 times higher rate than populous, high-income countries. So countries like us, we are 15 times the firearm homicide rate. So yes, from time to time there'll be 8 people stabbed in Japan. From time to time there'll be a mass shooting in Norway. But overall, when you look at the great context of time, we literally are murdering them. 23 times higher than Norway, 15 times higher than comparable countries in our income bracket. So when they say Norway, it's nonsense. On average, our firearm violence is through the roof. Well, so an interesting part of this is that the Martin Prosperity Institute has done a fascinating look into what correlates with gun violence and what does not correlate with gun violence in this country. Now, some of the results are surprising. First of all, did you know highest gun deaths per capita in the country is in the state of Alaska? Interesting. So, well, look, they looked at some factors that they thought might be relevant. For example, illegal drug use. Turns out does not lead to more gun violence on average when you look at per capita, you hold everything else even. Neurotic personalities, the crazy people. Well, if you have more crazy people in your state, you do not necessarily have more gun violence. High levels of unemployment, high levels of inequality. Now, liberals might have thought that that might lead to more gun violence. It doesn't. That does not correlate with gun violence, according to the data. What does lead to gun violence? Well, this is interesting. Lower average income, so that's not that surprising. Lack of education. If you're in a state with a higher percentage of college graduates, etc., you're less likely to be the victim of gun violence. These are all aggregate numbers. Now, here's interesting. States that have more Republicans elected, conservative voting areas, more likely to have gun violence, so keep voting for those Republicans. See how it turns out for you. And a deep culture of honor, which is really interesting. It's originally a study done by Richard Nisbet at the University of Michigan back in 1993 came up with this concept. And the idea of this culture of honor is you put extraordinary value on personal reputation, family, and property. Well, so if anybody touches that stuff, you respond with violence. This is obviously seen more in the South. And a recent 2009 study by Ryan Brown, Lindsay Osterman, and Colin Barnes at the University of Oklahoma also came to the same conclusion. So these things lead to more gun violence. Now, how about gun control? So this is really interesting. Will it help in keeping down gun deaths? Well, we go back to Richard Florida's studies on this. And he says, firearm deaths are significantly lower in states with stricter gun control legislation. In fact, there's a substantial negative correlation between firearm deaths and states that ban assault weapons. That's a negative 0.45. So if you ban assault weapons, you are far more likely to have less gun violence. Now, this is the most logical thing in the world, but there's so much propaganda in the country about it that you begin to think like, I don't know, maybe if you don't ban it, you'll have less. No, if you ban it, you have less gun violence. Of course. And then continuing, if you require trigger locks, less likely to have gun violence, a negative correlation of 0.42. And if you mandate safe storage requirements for guns, well, that's actually even the most effective, negative 0.48 correlation with gun violence. So if you do stricter gun control laws, guess what you have? Less gun violence. So when you hear politicians, when you hear the NRA and you hear propaganda about how gun control doesn't work, that is actually not true. It's not backed by the facts at all. The facts indicate that gun control does work. And in fact, if you live in areas that are conservative and Republican, you're more likely to die from gun violence. Congratulations.